Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's live stream. You know, we've been doing this for almost an entire year, kicking this off during the COVID days of 2020. And we've kept up this tradition because all of you in the audience keep tuning in to whatever the hot topic is in a particular week. Sometimes we're focused on cultural, kind of social issues, but recently, given all of the challenges that this country has with the new presidential administration, with single party majority in both the House and Senate, we are dealing this week with one of the big challenges facing us, and that is the recently passed House Resolution 1, the elections omnibus. And joining us to discuss that this week is one of our many excellent members of the Texas delegation. If you're tuning in from inside Texas, then you know Congressman Michael McCaul. He represents the 10th District of Texas. I believe he's in his 9th term. That district includes parts of Austin, where I'm joining you from today, but snakes all the way to Houston. Congressman McCaul, as you will see, is an expert on this issue, on foreign affairs, on homeland security, among other issues. If you're joining us outside Texas, then you have one of the leading figures in Congress of either party on these issues. And I think that we will all benefit from his analysis, not just of this particular bill, H.R. 1, which is now moved over to the Senate, but also some historical context about why we need to be so concerned about American election integrity. So all of that to say, if we've not met, I'm Kevin Roberts, have the privilege of being your host, and I welcome our guest, Congressman Michael McCaul, a good friend from just a few blocks from here. Congressman, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me. I want to thank Texas Public Policy Foundation for all of your great work. I know my wife, Linda, was on the board for a while, and we're huge fans and appreciate your service.
Well, thanks. And that's mutual, Congressman. We've done several events together over the years. They tend to focus on these questions of foreign affairs, homeland security. This, in a lot of ways, on elections is very similar because we have legitimate, that is, not sort of kooky concerns, but legitimate concerns about election integrity. And so let's just start high level there before getting into some of the provisions of this bill. Our audience, as you might imagine, is well-versed in policy, but not necessarily experts on the nuts and bolts of why this is a problem. But given your experience, not just as a congressman, but given your time in a courtroom as an attorney, give us 30,000-foot high-level view of why this is such an issue.
Well, it goes to the fundamental core of our democracy, our elections, and the integrity of those elections, whether it be a foreign adversary nation or whether it be states like California that have such a fraudulent system that the candidates don't know if they won until maybe a month afterwards. And we saw that happen in this election particularly. If I could take you back a little bit in time, in the late 90s, I was at a federal prosecutor at Main Justice, and I was assigned to the campaign finance task force. So one of my cases was the Johnny Chung case, which turned out to be, from an espionage standpoint and intrigue standpoint, probably the most fascinating case that I ever prosecuted, because it led us to the director of Chinese intelligence actively putting money, funneling money into the Clinton campaign in 1996. And so we got a guilty plea. He cooperated, and we were able to get the evidence to prove that not only the director of Chinese intelligence, but China Aerospace was collaborating with their intelligence apparatus to put money into the Clinton campaign. You ask yourself the question, why? Well, they like Clinton's policies, just like they probably don't like Trump's policies, because he stands up to China. And their tech transfer was a big issue back then. They wanted to join the World Trade Organization, satellite technology, which is why China Aerospace was so interested in getting Bill Clinton reelected. And my case was there were a lot of allegations, but I actually, proved the case that there was a connection between Chinese intelligence funding and the Clinton campaign going through Johnny Chung's, Hong Kong bank account. Then you fast forward to today, I chaired the China task force, and we got a lot of threats coming out of China as our report came out, particularly on the origins of COVID-19 that we translated into Mandarin and broke their firewall and got it viral in mainland China. So then President Xi and his spokesman started denouncing both me and the report. And getting back to the election side, we started to see about 20 news articles coming out, disinformation campaign about my race specifically. So yeah, they haven't changed their. Maybe they've moved from money to disinformation, but the idea of a foreign adversary nation trying to impact our election is real. And what I worry about, and Kevin, I want to thank you working with me, because we have to identify these vulnerabilities in the system that we have today. That the fraudulent behavior, we really have to crack down on this so that we're not vulnerable to something like that in the future. Not only, states like California being a threat the way they hold their elections, but also a foreign nation adversary like the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, thanks for that response, Congressman. I think that over the last few years, probably I can speak on behalf of most folks in the audience, that many of us who for years knew there was some issue with China, although not with the level of detail and evidence that you had in the late 90s, have discovered in that time, the last few years, that they're a real threat. In fact, I watched a speaker over the weekend in foreign affairs world, as you are, say, China used to believe that 2050 would be the time that they would surpass the United States. They've moved that up to the end of this decade, 2030. And that's not hyperbole. That's not coming from some sort of conspiracy land. This is coming from experts like that person, like you. And one of the many aspects in which they're exerting that control is elections. And so I want to get into some of the mechanics of what H.R. 1 would do if, God forbid, it becomes law. But before we make that transition and get into those details, I'm just curious if you could give our audience a sense of 2 or 3 or however many general vulnerabilities you see in the system of elections that the Chinese could take advantage of, or in fact are, present tense.
Yeah, and I think they got into the fundraising element in the late 90s,
Yeah.
but I think as they analyze our last election, which because of COVID, you had a lot of mail-in ballots, which is always more vulnerable to fraud. I think they will be taking a very close look at this and a deep dive, seeing how they can influence the system. And everything from voter ID, which the state of Texas has, but California doesn't follow that, to this ballot harvesting idea, where they just mail out all these ballots, and then political operatives come and pick up the ballots. That could be influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. These paper ballots, I think cyber attacks also. China's very good at cyber security and cyber attacks, potentially against our own voting machines. I stood up and authorized into law the cybersecurity and infrastructure agency at the Department of Homeland Security to assist states upon request with their election security, efforts. But I think all these vulnerabilities that have come out after this last election cycle, which a lot of it was a product of COVID, shows the vulnerabilities in the system and how they can take advantage of it.
Yeah, there is a lot there. As you know, because you've been familiar with our foundation for many years, we've always done some research on election transparency, election security, but it wasn't until about a year and a half ago that we took that on as a new research and action center. And I have to tell you, even though having done some political work in my private time outside of what I do in my day job, I've seen election fraud with my own eyes. I did not realize the scale that it exists. And for those folks in the audience who think that that's coming from sour grapes about how the presidential election turned out, as I've said often, that's not at all the case, although there's plenty to complain about in this election cycle. This kind of thing that you're outlining, whether influenced by the Chinese or by others, has been going on for a while. And to make the pivot to what I know a lot of our audience members want to hear about today from you, and that is House Resolution 1, now Senate 1. What are the most significant things, provisions in that bill that we need to be concerned about?
Well, what it is, in essence, is an attempt to federalize our elections. Our founding fathers clearly wanted that authority in the states. They wanted the states to certify their elections, and they didn't want presidential races to be determined by the Congress. That was a state right issue. So inherently, the Constitution provides that authorities to the states, not the Congress. That this bill will take what happened around COVID and make it permanent, and it will federalize our election system, which I believe, on its face, is unconstitutional. But there are many other provisions that I think are quite shocking. I think one of the biggest ones is using taxpayer dollars to fund campaigns at a lower dollar amount. It's a 6-to-1 match of your taxpayer, the federal taxpayers' money, to go into elections to support a candidate that they could be completely against from an ideology standpoint and philosophically, and politically. I think that on its face is unconstitutional. But beyond that, it takes corporate money, which under the federal law is illegal. It takes these fines and fees from corporations and then funnels that money into elections, into federal elections. This is, again, I think it violates the federal election campaign laws on its face. But you take that with the use of taxpayer dollars to fund political candidates that you may be completely 100% against their type of view, I think is going down a moral hazard path, to be honest with you. And that's certainly not what the founding fathers intended. And I think it really permanently implements what we saw during the last election with COVID, those into law. Primarily, it's taking California and New York's system and turning it into a federal law, where you're going to see a complete takeover of the federal elections by the federal government. And I like to go back to some of my colleagues that lost last election, I think in large part to voter fraud. I'm going to pick 2 states, California and New York. Young Kim won on election day, last go around, and then found, a month later, finds out that she lost. And then Claudia Tenney, same thing in New York, and both serve on my committee on the House Foreign Affairs. She didn't know until 2.5 months after. So we have to find a better way to do this. And we'll get into the bill that you and I are working on, but a better way to have some certainty into the system and have these votes counted prior to the election, not after the election. And I think that's a real big problem. This bill is a complete disaster, and I think it's a train wreck that will not have a chance in the Senate. That's the good news. Even though we did lose the Senate, I don't think this has any hope of passing into law, and let's hope not.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to one of the provisions I would think you and I agree the most egregious about HR 1, which is federalizing elections and how that would affect, for example, some of the work we're doing here in the Texas legislature this session. But I want to leave that alone for just a minute to follow up with what you just mentioned, and that is the prospects of HR 1 passing in the Senate. As our audience members probably know, but might need to be reminded of, even though the Democrats effectively control the Senate because of Vice President Harris's tie-breaking vote, they have to hit 60 votes. They have to be able to get past cloture in order to have the bill voted on the floor. And so the fight, unless I'm mistaken, correct me if I am, is not even so much about HR 1. It's about whether the filibuster can be protected in the Senate. And so, what are the prospects there about any of the Democrats sort of waffling on that, joining the Republicans to protect it?
Yeah, I think the filibuster is still alive and well, and I don't think the Democrats want to cede that, knowing that it could be used against them in the future. So what you're seeing today with the COVID-19 package, the $2 trillion package, which is the largest spending package ever passed by Congress. Kevin, it got passed out of the Senate by tie-breaking vote. It's going to the House tomorrow. And to your point, the only way they can get this done with 50 votes plus the vice president's is to go through this budgetary process called reconciliation. And there are a few things that qualify for that. This election security bill, HR 1, is not in that category. So I think that's why I'm so optimistic it will not get through the Senate. But they're using reconciliation to get this huge spending package that less than 9% actually has anything to do with COVID relief, in my judgment, from what I've seen. And most of it is a bailout program for the states that had, the bad debt on the books before the pandemic, occurred. So, and then I think the next package you'll see on reconciliation will be their tax package, which I know we're not here to talk about that, but I'm very frightened about what I'm hearing on that end as a taxpayer. The increase in taxes on all levels that will take place, but that's why I think HR1 has little chance for success in the process.
Yeah. So, and we would agree with that. Of course, we probably encourage our audience to remain vigilant on that. There is some key, more centrist Democrats who have been essential to blocking efforts to change the rules of the Senate. And yet, conversely, as you point out, any bill that has to do with finances, with taxes, with so-called COVID relief, even the recently passed bill, of which only 5% is probably COVID relief, absolutely has not just a chance, but a good chance of passing the Senate, because you only need the 50 votes, with the vice president breaking the tie. We will, as we were sort of talking about before we went live, we could spend a few hours just catching up with you on everything going on in DC. We'll try to keep it focused for the most part on this election issue because it's so important. So let me just sort of highlight something before we move on to the bill that we've been working on with you. And that is our foundation, along with a lot of groups, conservative groups in the country, also do work in the Texas legislature. In fact, it's or their legislature, that's 80% of our work. And we've got 3 bills that we're working on right now that basically, just to write a headline, would take Texas election law from a B or a B minus, it's not terrible, but it's not great, to an A plus, which is what everyone expects Texas law to be. We would make sure the Secretary of State has appropriate authority. We would make sure that people who vote actually are alive and are citizens. We would make sure that people who have sent in a mail-in ballot didn't have that ballot harvested, that they actually submitted it themselves within the timeline that is required by law. All of these provisions need to happen in order to ensure that our future elections are transparent and that no one's vote, whether they're a liberal or a conservative, is stolen. We have no interest in any voter fraud whatsoever. The point is, if by some chance HR1 passes the Senate and becomes law, then all of those efforts at the state level are moot, right?
Right. I mean, that's the danger, is that it will preempt. I do think the bill is unconstitutional on its face, but all the great efforts you're taking at the state level, and I applaud you for it, to clean up the system. We want to see that across the country. But at the end of the day, I think, again, the founders believed that inherently the states had the rights when it comes to their elections, not the federal government. And so I think our goal is to try to effectuate change, like what you're doing, the good work you're doing to make the system more secure. And you can, when you vote in person, that's always the best, right? And you got, I think the early voting being opened had more in-person voting. When you get into troubles, when you get into the mail-in ballots and the ballot harvesting, that's what's very susceptible to abuse and corruption and influence. And so I think, again, what you're doing gets to the heart of the matter. But the bigger question is, what can we do to change it so in presidential races, we're not seeing things like what we saw come out of California and Pennsylvania and New York, and that's a broader issue. I'd like to see the party get a little more involved in. The Democrats have a great nationwide system of lawsuits that they file to make voting, for ballot harvesting, for instance. I don't see the Republicans, but we have that kind of machine operation. And they're also very active in redistricting, as you know. And the former Attorney General has been, under Obama, has been trying to change redistricting. That's another thing HR1 does. Is while what we do in the state of Texas, our elected officials draw the districts, this would turn it over to some outside commission to do that, which again, I think goes against the will of the people fundamentally. And that's another, I think, egregious violation within HR1.
Yeah, I tell you, there's a lot there. Before we move on to sort of general concerns about elections from the rest of the world. In other words, America's role in being kind of the beacon of election transparency. I just want to ask you a follow-up question about redistricting, not what we were planning to talk about today, but it's a live wire for everyone, wherever they're tuning in. Congressman, we tend to have more people tune into this live stream from outside Texas than inside, but given your expertise, I know they'll want to hear from you. What should we expect from redistricting, especially given these now 2, if not 3 delays by the Census Bureau in providing the data on which legislatures will act to redraw district lines?
That's a great question. Of course, members of Congress watch this pretty closely for obvious reasons, but I think the census has been delayed, and I don't think we'll get that information until the summer. And without that data, like for instance, in my district, I had 450,000 people voting in what should be 650,000, total district. That tells me I have far more people in my district. I mean, I could have 1 million, but we don't know how to draw the lines, or the state legislature doesn't know until they get those numbers. And we won't get those until the summertime. What I hope that we can, I think we're going to gain 3 seats in Texas. And probably a 2-to-1, I would say 2 Republican, 1 Democrat. I would hope it does not delay or postpone the primary elections, that we can stay on course. But obviously, if you don't have the data till the end of the summer, it's going to, it takes a while to get all this information together and draw the lines. It does give me some hope in getting the majority back, Kevin, as you and I talked about earlier, because we are going to pick up seats through redistricting, I think, in Texas and Florida. And also traditionally the party out of power in midterm elections, when you get, a Democrat in the White House, the Republicans historically are going to get more numbers. So I think the trend is going very well for us to recapture the majority if we do things right.
So thank you. We'll turn to audience questions here momentarily, Congressman. I'll ask you one follow-up question. But before I do that, I just want to sort of underscore what you just said about redistricting, at least here in Texas. If we get census data on September 30th, which is what the Census Bureau has told Texas legislature and others will be the date, our legislature will gavel out of session on the last Monday of May, which means they got to come back in special session this fall. The filing deadline for all candidates, Republican, Democrat, et cetera, is in early December of this year for next spring's primary, which is in March. You start seeing how compressed that calendar is. And my point to the audience, whether they would be Democrat, Republican, or something in between, is that that's not good for anybody. That we want, as a civil society, as a transparent government, regardless of our political inclinations, for this process to be as transparent, as smooth as possible. So the potential for something to go awry is significant, especially given what we've been talking about today, which is the problems with election security. So I'm going to ask you the proverbial magic wand question, Congressman. I'll give you a magic wand, and in your role as a member of Congress, knowing that states have most of the authority on election law, what fixes would you make at the federal level to improve America's election system?
Well, look, first of all, we have to be very careful not to do anything that would federalize the elections. Again, I think under the Constitution, that right is inherently within the states' rights. But I do think we can effectuate some of the changes you and I have talked about. Some of the great things you're doing with the 3 bills in the state legislature to incentivize states through the power of the purse. So when California takes money under HAVA, which is basically the Help Americans Voting Act, or they take, let's say, grant money from the Department of Homeland Security to help bring more security to their election system, that could come with some strings that would call for minimal standards, most of which you discussed already, that you are going to effectuate in Texas, so that through the power, not federalizing, but making it more transparent and making it more secure. And I think what has happened, what I hate to see as a result of the last election, is so much distrust and loss of faith in the system itself, such that they may not even be encouraged to go vote because they think the whole thing is rigged. And so I think restoring that trust is so important in the process. And I think the biggest way we can do it at the federal level would be the bill that you and I are working on that would basically tie, these funding streams. If you're going to take federal taxpayer dollars, you have to have these minimum standards, and that would be eliminating ballot harvesting. It would be having audits of elections, counting your ballots before election day. I don't know why these states have to wait until election day to count the early vote, right? And that's why it takes them a month. And not counting votes that came in after the election. Just certain basic standards like that, to me, would go a long ways in restoring faith and confidence in the system, which, I'm concerned about the loss of confidence in the system. And I think what you and the state legislature are accomplishing, my hat's off to you, because I really think that's going to help restore Texans' sense of trust. But the federal elections, I think that's really the best way to go about it. And also what I mentioned earlier is maybe having, the party engaging in lawsuits in some of these states that have such a willful violation, of the election process. And just basic stuff like voter ID. Under HR1, you can show up without any identification at all and just sign a piece of paper that this is who you are. I mean, to me, that is ripe for fraud. If there's no way to verify that that is the person actually voting, if you can just go in and sign a document saying, I'm John Smith and I want to vote, you can imagine the level of fraud that we're going to have with a system like that. Yet that's essentially what happens in the state of California and New York. And that's why so many people have lost faith in it.
Yeah, I tell you, I want to ask a follow-up question, but we're starting to get some questions from our audience, Congressman. So we'll turn our attention to those and have several questions in the queue already. The first is about HR1. This is from an audience member. I don't know whether they're in your district or not, but they're asking about HR1 and asking if it fails in the Senate as a single bill, is there a possibility that it's going to be split into several bills? And even though we will have defeated the overall bill, that we might have to be dealing with this threat piecemeal over the next year or so?
That's an excellent question. I can only give you what is passed as prologue, and that is last Congress, they passed a watered down version. And they've actually put this one on steroids since last Congress to our detriment. But they just, for them, it's a messaging bill, I think. And we voted on it once last Congress. It failed, or it passed the Senate, but House, but failed in the Senate. So my guess is it probably goes nowhere, but we have to keep a watchful eye to make sure they don't try to sneak it in some must-pass bill. That's why we had to look so closely at the COVID bill when, Pelosi is earmarking to her, district for this tunnel under Silicon Valley, billions of dollars, and Schumer did a similar infrastructure. And we had to really go through the bill to find it. Because that's what they slip in these things like that into these larger must-pass bills in their perspective, and that's where it's right for that kind of misbehavior. Fortunately, we caught those and they pulled them out of the bill. But no, I don't think, in my judgment, because of the filibuster, I think HR1 is dead on arrival.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll keep hoping and praying for that. There's an additional question from another audience member about one provision of HR1 that we haven't talked about yet, and that is lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. And I presume this is a devil's advocate question, but perhaps this audience member actually genuinely wants to know what's wrong with lowering the voting age from 18 to 16.
Well, I have 5 children, and God love them, but I do think there's a certain legal age for a lot of things, that we tied to legal questions, and I think 18 is about the right age to have the best judgment. There's a reason why there are certain age requirements in the Constitution for members of Congress, and I think all that is. I think 18 is about the right age, and they're obviously trying to target the younger generation that may be less informed, that they can, with their propaganda, influence in some way. The other thing I failed to mention. was, they tried to pass an amendment that would allow convicted felons the right to vote, um, which is on its face is crazy. But fortunately, that did not pass. But they tried to put that in the bill too.
Yeah, it's become the proverbial Christmas tree bill. All of the liberals, and not just run-of-the-mill liberals, but radical liberals wish list onto that bill. So we're going to see more of the same. So the next audience member with a question wants to shift gears a little bit, and I'm sure you're game for that. You're always a good sport, Congressman. What are the other issues facing us beyond elections? You previewed a few of them, but I guess they're looking for potential legislative challenges coming down the pike after this one concerning elections.
Yeah, well, I think you're going to see they're going to try to pass a gun control bill. They're going to, I think, on a broad scale, codifying the law with what the Biden administration is doing now with immigration. So I think this week we could see one of those two bills, if not both. We're going to have the COVID-19 bill on the floor tomorrow. But yeah, these are, check the box bills for them, messaging. And again, for the same reasons we talked about with HR1, I don't see passage, but they will try to compromise our Second Amendment, with gun control legislation, and then have a really far-reaching immigration bill that would pretty much put on a path to citizenship all illegals within the country. We've seen what the Biden administration has done with the stroke of a pen just in a month or so. And now the numbers are surging of illegal crossings. They also changed the policy on, I thought what the great thing the prior administration did was, once you're in Mexico, you have no fear of persecution, political persecution. If you want to apply for asylum, then do it in Mexico. And that was one of the first things he erased with the pen. And I'm getting a lot of complaints from my constituents on this issue, whether it be they're eligible for the vaccine to, how do we handle this situation, which we had under control.
Yeah.
I think, the tougher policies and messaging, but it also, I think in a lot of respects, from what I see on the foreign affairs front, our foreign nation adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And I think, this immigration and border security always ties into national security, because if you can't control who's coming in your country or have any accounting of it, you don't know who's coming in. Now, I would say most are, where the traffickers are making a lot of money off these kids that they direct up from Central America. But you've also got some really bad actors coming into the United States. And that's why when I was a federal prosecutor in the Western District, chief of counterterrorism, national security, right where you are, to being chair of Homeland Security, I always made the border a big issue. And I think they're going to completely reverse the prior administration's trend on that issue.
Well, it's unfortunate, and you and I say that not just from the standpoint of knowing that the previous policy worked, but from the human standpoint, right? If what happens, what we think is going to happen, which is this massive surge of at least 100,000 illegal crossings per month, starting as soon as the weather continues to warm up, April, May, June, then what we're going to see is human tragedy that we would want never to happen, regardless of someone's motivation for taking the action, right? We can at least understand why someone would want to come to the United States. This leads me to the next question from one of our audience members, which is, in light of what seems to be a radical agenda for opening up the border by the Biden administration, by the one party with similar thoughts, controlling both chambers of Congress, what can be done to stop that from happening, if anything?
Well, the executive branch can do a lot on their own when it comes to, the executive branch enforces the laws, but I would argue he's changing a lot of the laws, but some of its prior policies. As for any action legislatively in the Congress, I think, going back to what we talked about, and they will pass it in the House, but I see little hope for passage in the Senate for the reasons we talked about
Yeah.
previously. I can't see how they could put this under a reconciliation process to get through the Senate. So I don't, I don't see that really happening.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, you've been generous with your time, so we've got time for one other audience question, and then the question I always ask our guests, which I'll save for last. Well, the last audience question is, what can we, this is an audience member asking, do to help those of you who are trying to hold the line in DC? I know those of you who are elected officials and sacrificing your time by being up in the nation's capital each week are often looking for some help. Here's someone offering, what's the advice you would give them?
Well, thank God for Texas Policy Foundation. I mean, I think the work you'll do at the foundation really it galvanizes our principles and takes it to a legislative level, and the outreach is phenomenal. I would have the caller take a look at the bill that Kevin, you and I are going to hopefully introduce maybe as early as this week on election integrity. On the issues we talked about. And I think it's going to be important when we do introduce a bill to galvanize that kind of support. I will try to make it bipartisan because that's the best chance for success. But I think to galvanize your supporters and mine, people want to have faith in the system again. And they lost trust in the system after the last election. And I think the legislation you're working on at the state level, the more your viewers can help you in those efforts, but also the legislation that you and I are working on together at the federal level is the best chance we have to save our democracy from fraudulent elections. And so I would just get involved with the party, get involved in the process, Texas Public Policy Foundation, and with your own members of Congress.
Yeah, it's sometimes you feel that question a lot, I'm sure, given your role. I do as well, given mine. We're always doing research and helping members like you draft bills. But the most important thing that happens is that thousands, tens of thousands of Americans put pressure on elected officials to do the right thing. There you are doing precisely that on a number of issues. And it's really important that in spite of all these reasons the left of center media wants to give us not to be engaged, that we actually do the opposite and be engaged. And that leads me to the question I always save for last, Congressman. I've been looking forward to asking you this, having gotten to know you some. And that is, over the last 12, 14 months in the United States, we've gone through a heck of a time with the health threats of COVID itself, with the equally bad threats I would submit from government shutdowns, which have been overwrought, to an election cycle, which has been very, very tense, to say the least, to the aftermath of that. And here we are in the spring of 2021, a year later, still not sure what the future holds. In spite of all of that, why are you optimistic about America?
Well, I am an eternal optimist. And I think the last year, and people were ready for 2020 to be over. And then we came into 2021 and we had things like January 6th occur. But I'm always optimistic because I really believe in what our founding fathers stood for. And I'm always amazed when I look back at that document that they created and how brilliant that was, and laying out a roadmap for future generations. And because of their spirit of freedom and democracy, and Kevin, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I look at countries where people don't have the freedoms we have. I look at the crackdown in Hong Kong by the Chinese Communist Party without a shot fired, invading Hong Kong and trampling on their basic human rights that they have, that our founding fathers stood up for so much. I see, they persecute the Uyghur Muslim population that finally we have denounced as genocide, to Putin's Russia and the oppression of his people, to the Ayatollah in Iran and what they do there, down to, North Korea, and then to Venezuela as well. Socialism doesn't work. And anybody that thinks it does, take a look at Venezuela, the most prosperous was at one time in Latin America, now being really destroyed. And you look at Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba, that hasn't worked out so well. I do think that contrast is important, that socialism never works, it fails. We have some great new freshmen in office like Young Kim, who's our great outreach to the Asian community. Because the Asian community, when they think of communism, they think of President Xi. When they Maria Salazar, a Hispanic from Miami, she's on my committee. When they look at socialism, they look at the Castro regime and Maduro down in Venezuela. They don't look at Denmark and Finland, those European countries. So I think at the end of the day, though, I believe in the American people, and I do think our founders set up the right process for basic freedoms of human rights and democracy. And that is the resounding message that we have. We are a beacon of hope and democracy for the world. I still believe that. And I see it a lot in the new perch I have on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And they do believe that the United States is still the guardian of those freedoms of basic human rights and democracy. And so that's why I remain an optimist.
Well, thank you very much for that. I know our audience always appreciates hearing that from our guests, especially from a member of Congress who really does have significant expertise in the foreign affairs with the histories and current political context of those other nations. Well, Congressman Michael McCaul, I tell you this each time we meet, I'd spend the afternoon chatting with you, but I know you're a busy guy representing us up there in DC. I hope those of you in the audience who happen not to live in Texas know that you still have a great voice in Congressman McCaul. You're a great patriot, sir. Thanks for all your work. We're looking forward to working with you on this election security bill in DC. May God continue to prosper the work of your hands. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks to the foundation as well.
You bet. Those of you in the audience, thanks so much for joining us. Have a great week.